He was known, at least in the circles he moved within, as a man of depth. People often introduced him with a quiet reverence. He has studied many paths, and it was true. He had read extensively: ancient scriptures, modern psychology, philosophy, neuroscience, leadership, spirituality. His shelves were heavy with books marked by notes, highlights, and folded corners. His mind was even heavier. In conversations, he listened just long enough to recognize a familiar concept, then gently interrupted, not to dismiss, but to complete the other person's thought. He rarely raised his voice. His ego did not roar, it whispered. It wore the disguise of refinement. He believed himself open-minded. After all, he welcomed new ideas, so long as they fit neatly into what he already knew. And so, when an unexplainable restlessness began to surface in his life, he was genuinely confused. By every visible measure, he had succeeded. His career was stable, his reputation intact. People sought his advice. Some even called him wise. Yet late at night, when the world softened into silence, something within him refused to rest. A quiet tension lived behind his thoughts, like a cup filled so tightly that even a single additional drop would cause it to spill. He called it intellectual fatigue, but the truth was simpler and far more uncomfortable. He was exhausted from carrying himself. The restlessness did not come as pain, but as a subtle dissatisfaction. Meditation, which once felt enlightening, had become mechanical. Insight no longer surprised him, it merely confirmed him. Even silence felt crowded with commentary, analysis, interpretation. He noticed something unsettling. No matter how much he learned, peace did not deepen. It flattened. One evening, after a lecture he delivered on mindfulness and self-awareness, a young listener asked him a simple question: "How do you sit with not knowing?" He smiled kindly and offered an answer that sounded complete, polished, convincing. The young listener nodded, but something in their eyes revealed disappointment, not ignorance. That night, the question returned to him like an echo he could not silence. How do you sit with not knowing? He realized, perhaps for the first time, that he had not sat with not knowing in years. He had built an identity around understanding, around articulation, around being the one who could explain, and explanations had become his refuge. It was around this time that he heard of the old Zen teacher living beyond the city, in a place where the roads narrowed and phones lost their signal. The stories were inconsistent, even contradictory. Some said the teacher rarely spoke. Others said he answered questions with questions, or not at all. A few claimed they left frustrated, feeling they had learned nothing. Strangely, those were often the ones who returned. At first, the man dismissed the idea of visiting. He had studied Zen extensively. He understood the metaphors, the koans, the paradoxes. What could an old teacher possibly add? And yet, the restlessness persisted. One morning, without announcing his intention to anyone, not even himself, he found his body packing a small bag. Books stayed behind. Notes remained untouched. He told himself he was going out of curiosity, not need. Curiosity felt safer. The journey took longer than expected. The road twisted through forests that grew quieter the deeper he went. With each mile, his thoughts became louder, scrambling to maintain relevance. What should I ask? How should I frame my question? What if the teacher is unimpressive? By the time he arrived, his mind had already rehearsed the meeting 100 times. The dwelling was simple. No sign, no gate, just a wooden structure resting humbly among trees that seemed uninterested in human ambition. A faint scent of tea leaves lingered in the air. The teacher appeared without ceremony. An ordinary man in ordinary robes, eyes clear, posture relaxed. There was nothing mystical about him. And yet, standing there, the seeker felt an unexpected unease. The teacher bowed lightly and gestured for him to enter. Inside, the room was sparse. A low table, 2 cushions, a teapot resting between them. They sat. The seeker began, as he always did, with context. He spoke of his background, his studies, the paths he had explored, the insights he had gathered. He referenced traditions, teachers, frameworks. His words flowed effortlessly, each sentence building upon the last, forming a structure that was difficult to interrupt. The teacher listened without reaction. No nodding, no affirming sounds, no visible disagreement. Encouraged, the seeker continued. He explained his understanding of suffering, impermanence, non-attachment. He spoke of mindfulness, awareness, compassion. His voice carried confidence, but beneath it trembled a faint urgency, an unspoken plea to be recognized. See me. Understand how much I know. At no point did the teacher stop him. Instead, the teacher reached for the teapot. Without a word, he began to pour. The tea flowed smoothly into the cup, rising steadily. The seeker continued speaking, unaware at first. Only when the liquid reached the rim did his words slow. When it spilled over onto the table, he stopped completely. Tea overflowed, dripping quietly onto the floor. "Master," the seeker said at last. Unable to hide his irritation, "the cup is full." The teacher continued pouring for a moment longer, just enough to make the point undeniable, then gently set the teapot down. "Yes," the teacher said softly. "It is." Silence filled the room. In that silence, something unfamiliar surfaced in the seeker. Not anger, not confusion, but exposure. For the first time in a long while, he felt seen not for what he knew, but for what he was carrying. The teacher looked at him, not critically, not kindly, but clearly. "You come to learn," the teacher said, "but you bring a cup already full." The words landed without force. No accusation, no instruction, yet they unsettled him more than any challenge ever had. The seeker opened his mouth to respond, to clarify, to defend, to explain. But something stopped him. Perhaps it was the tea pooling on the floor. Perhaps it was the realization that every response forming in his mind sounded rehearsed. For the first time, his knowledge did not feel like a gift. It felt like weight. The teacher spoke again, gently. "When the cup is full," he said, "nothing new can enter. And when nothing new can enter, learning does not begin." The seeker felt a tightening in his chest, not because he disagreed, but because he recognized the truth he had avoided. All his life, he had been filling the cup. Rarely had he emptied it. And in that quiet room, with tea cooling between them and words suddenly insufficient, the seeker began to sense that the greatest obstacle on the path to wisdom was not ignorance, but the certainty that one already knows. This realization did not yet bring peace. It brought discomfort, but discomfort, as he would soon discover, was the first honest teacher he had met in a very long time. The silence did not end when the teacher finished speaking. It lingered, unmoving, unresponsive, like a presence that refused to be shaped by the seeker's expectations. The man waited for something else to follow, a clarification, a teaching, perhaps a gentle elaboration to soften the discomfort that had begun to rise in his chest. Nothing came. The teacher simply sat, hands resting lightly on his knees, eyes open yet unfocused, as though listening not to the seeker, but to the space between them. The teacup remained where it was, a thin ring of spilled liquid darkening the wooden table. No one rushed to clean it. The seeker shifted on his cushion. Silence, he realized, was not empty. It was crowded with his own impulses. The urge to speak pressed against him, insistent and familiar. For years, silence had always been a cue, a pause waiting to be filled with insight, explanation, or reassurance. He had built a life around responding to silence with meaning. Now, silence responded with nothing. He cleared his throat. "I understand the metaphor," he said carefully, choosing his words with practiced precision. "You're suggesting that preconceptions limit learning. I've taught similar ideas myself." The teacher did not respond. No nod, no correction, no acknowledgement at all. The seeker felt a faint irritation. He had expected resistance or agreement. Either would have allowed him to position himself. Instead, he was met with something far more destabilizing: irrelevance. His words, so often received with interest or praise, simply dissolved into the quiet. The teacher reached for the teapot again. The seeker watched closely this time, alert, almost defensive. But instead of pouring, the teacher lifted the pot. examined it briefly, then set it aside. He poured hot water into another cup, empty this time, and placed it in front of the seeker. No instruction accompanied the gesture. The cup sat there, steaming gently. The seeker stared at it, unsure whether he was meant to drink or observe. The teacher didn't either. He simply waited. Minutes passed. At first, the seeker's mind raced. It searched for meaning, constructing interpretations as it always had. Is this another lesson? Is the empty cup meant to symbolize openness? Is he waiting for me to comment? His training urged him to decode, to grasp. But as the silence stretched on, something unusual began to happen. His thoughts lost momentum. Without feedback, they began to tire. Like waves crashing endlessly against a shore that refused to erode. His inner commentary gradually softened. The cup continued to steam. He noticed details he would normally overlook. The faint hiss of hot water cooling, the way light from the window touched the rim of the cup, the subtle rhythm of his own breath. None of these observations felt profound, and yet they felt real. For the first time since arriving, he was not rehearsing a response. The teacher finally spoke, not to explain, but to ask, "Why did you come?" The question was simple. No philosophical framing. No implication of depth. The seeker answered immediately, reflexively. To learn. The teacher tilted his head slightly, as if listening beyond the words. What do you wish to learn? The seeker paused. This time, the answer did not arrive fully formed. I want to deepen my understanding, he said after a moment. To refine what I know. The teacher nodded once, not in approval, but recognition. And what would you be willing to lose for that? The question struck harder than expected. Lose? The seeker felt a tightening behind his eyes. He had spent years accumulating knowledge, perspective, credibility. Learning, to him, had always meant addition. Growth was expansion. Loss had never entered the equation. I don't see learning as losing anything, he said carefully. It's about gaining clarity. The teacher's gaze softened. Clarity often comes when something falls away, he said. But that is difficult to accept when identity is involved. The word identity landed heavily. The seeker opened his mouth to object, to assert that he was not attached, that he understood impermanence, that identity itself was an illusion. But the words felt hollow even before they were spoken. The teacher had not accused him. He had simply named something. They sat again in silence. This silence was different. It no longer felt like an absence demanding to be filled. It felt intentional, like an invitation with no instructions attached. The seeker became aware of a subtle fear rising within him. Without speaking, without explaining, without being validated or challenged, who was he in this room? He realized, with discomfort, that much of his sense of self depended on being engaged with, on being questioned, debated, affirmed. Silence stripped away those familiar markers. In the quiet, there was no role to perform. His body reacted before his mind could justify it. His shoulders tensed. His breathing became shallow. The urge to reassert himself returned, not loudly, but persistently. "Master," he said, breaking the stillness. "If you have something to teach me, I'm ready to listen." The teacher smiled, not unkindly, but knowingly. "I am listening," he said. The seeker felt heat rise to his face. The statement unsettled him more than a reprimand would have. If the teacher was already listening, then what was he waiting for? The teacher continued gently. "You are waiting for me to speak so that you may receive. But learning does not always arrive through words." He gestured toward the cup. "Sometimes it arrives through space." The seeker followed the gesture, his gaze settling once again on the empty cup. He noticed something he had missed before. His hand had been hovering near it for several minutes, as though unsure whether to reach out. "What happens," the teacher asked quietly, "when nothing is being offered?" The seeker searched for an answer. None came that felt honest. "I feel exposed," he admitted finally. The teacher nodded. "That is often the beginning." The words were simple, but they resonated deeply. Exposed. Yes, that was the sensation. Without concepts to shield him, without language to organize experience, he felt unprotected. naked in a way he had not known since childhood. The teacher leaned forward slightly. "Most people come seeking answers," he said. "Few are prepared for the silence that reveals the questions beneath their questions." The seeker felt something shift inside him, a subtle loosening. Not relief, something more fragile. He realized he had arrived expecting instruction, but what he was receiving was permission. Permission not to know. Permission not to respond. Permission to sit without managing his own image. This permission felt both liberating and terrifying. The teacher stood and moved toward the window. Outside, leaves stirred gently in the breeze. He did not point them out. He did not comment on their beauty. He simply stood, watching. The seeker watched too. Time passed without being measured. For the first time in a very long while, the seeker was not learning about something. He was simply being present with what was. And in that presence, a quiet realization emerged, not as a thought, but as a felt truth. The silence was not withholding anything. It was offering space, a space where his need to control understanding could soften, a space where learning did not require mastery, a space where the cup did not need to be filled or defended. The teacher turned back toward him. "This is the invitation," he said softly. Nothing more. No ceremony followed. No conclusion. But something irreversible had begun. The seeker had not yet emptied his cup, but for the first time, he had stopped refilling it. And in that pause, in that wordless interval between grasping and letting go, the door to a deeper kind of learning quietly opened. The tea had long since stopped steaming. Its surface lay still, reflecting the dim light of the room like a quiet mirror. The seeker noticed this before he noticed anything else. The way the liquid no longer moved, no longer gave off warmth. It was as if time itself had slowed, waiting for something within him to catch up. The teacher returned to his seat and picked up the teapot once more. There was no announcement, no explanation. The motion was unhurried, almost ordinary. If the seeker had not been watching closely, he might have missed it altogether. But he was watching now. Every movement felt amplified. The slight tilt of the wrist. The faint sound of liquid shifting inside the pot. The way the teacher's grip remained relaxed, neither firm nor careless. The seeker's mind immediately leapt into interpretation. Is this the same lesson again? Is he testing my reaction this time? Am I supposed to stop him? The stream of tea began to pour into the cup. At first, the seeker said nothing. He told himself he was practicing acceptance, presence, non-interference. After all, he had spoken many times about allowing things to unfold naturally. The tea level rose. Halfway up the cup, a quiet tension appeared in his chest. Not fear, anticipation. His eyes followed the liquid closely, calculating how much space remained. The teacher did not look at the cup. His gaze rested somewhere beyond it, unfocused, unconcerned. The tea reached the rim. A thin meniscus formed, trembling with the slightest movement. The seeker held his breath without realizing it. Then the tea spilled over. A single drop slid down the side of the cup and landed on the table. Another followed, then another. The sound was soft, almost polite, but struck the seeker with unexpected force. "Master," he said quickly, his voice sharper than he intended. "It's full." The teacher continued pouring. The stream did not change, steady, calm, indifferent to the protest. "Please," the seeker said, leaning forward now. "It's overflowing." Tea ran freely across the table, dripping onto the floor. The warmth spread outward in slow, deliberate patterns, staining the wood, darkening the surface. Only then did the teacher stop. He set the teapot down gently, as if nothing unusual had occurred. "Yes," he said, "I see." The seeker stared at the mess, a mix of irritation and embarrassment tightening his throat. His first instinct was to apologize, not for interrupting, but for the spill. Disorder made him uneasy, waste unsettled him. He reached for a cloth to clean the table. The teacher placed a hand over his, stopping him. "Leave it," he said. The seeker froze. "Why?" he asked. The teacher did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked at the seeker, not at his face but at his posture, the forward lean, the tension in his shoulders, the tight grip on the cloth. Tell me, the teacher said quietly, what disturbed you just now? The seeker opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. The obvious answer felt too shallow. The tea, he said finally. It was wasted. The teacher waited. Andy prompted. The seeker hesitated. He felt something uncomfortable pressing upward, something he usually bypassed with explanation. I fell out of control, he admitted. The teacher nodded. When did that feeling arise? He asked. The seeker replayed the moment in his mind. The rising liquid, the approaching rim. Before it spilled, he said slowly, when I knew it would. The teacher smiled faintly. So the discomfort did not come from the overflow, he said. It came from the certainty. The words struck deep. The seeker had always believed control came from knowing, from anticipating outcomes, from staying ahead of events. Yet here, knowing what would happen had created tension, not peace. The teacher gestured toward the cup. Your mind, he said, is much like this. The seeker followed the gesture. The cup stood there, full to the edge, its contents no longer welcoming anything new. You have filled it carefully, the teacher continued, with study, with insight, with experience. Each addition made sense at the time. The seeker felt a surge of pride, quickly followed by confusion. Then why does it feel like a problem? He asked. The teacher lifted the cup and held it between them. When the cup is full, he said, there is no room to receive. And when there is no room to receive, even the act of giving becomes violence. The word startled him. Violence, the seeker repeated. The teacher nodded. Not the violence of force, he clarified, but the violence of excess, of ignoring limits, of insisting that more is always better. The seeker looked again at the spilled tea. What had seemed wasteful now felt symbolic. How often, the teacher asked, have you tried to take in something new without first letting go of what you already hold? The seeker swallowed. Too often. He remembered conversations where he listened only to respond. Teachings he filtered through existing frameworks. Moments of insight he dismissed because they did not align with what he already believed. Even now, part of him was trying to categorize this lesson, to file it away neatly under Zen metaphors. The teacher seemed to sense this. You see, he said, the cup does not suffer from being full. It simply cannot change. The seeker felt a tightening in his chest. Change. That was the word he rarely applied to himself. Growth, yes. Refinement, certainly. But change implied loss. It implied uncertainty. He had built his life around continuity, around being recognizable, reliable, consistent. The teacher set the cup down again. Tell me, he said, who are you without what you know? The question felt like a sudden drop. The seeker stopped. His mind searched desperately for an answer, but every response began with a qualification. I am someone who understands. I am someone who has studied. I am someone who teaches. Each one relied on knowledge. I don't know, he said at last. The teacher did not correct him. Instead, he smiled. That, he said, is the first honest answer you have given today. The seeker felt something loosen inside him. Not relief, but vulnerability. His chest felt open in a way that was unfamiliar and slightly frightening. But if I empty the cup, he asked, won't I lose everything I've learned? The teacher shook his head gently. Emptying is not forgetting, he said. It is releasing the need to carry. The seeker considered this. For years, he had carried his understanding like armor. Protective, impressive, heavy. What happens, he asked quietly, when the cup is empty? The teacher looked at him for a long moment. Then, he said, it becomes useful again. The simplicity of the answer stunned him. Useful, not enlightened, not superior, not complete, just useful. The teacher stood and began to wipe the table slowly, deliberately. He did not rush. He did not avoid the spill. Each motion was careful, attentive. Learning, he said, does not begin when the cup is empty. The seeker frowned slightly. No, he asked. It begins, the teacher continued, when you stop being afraid of emptiness. The seeker felt a quiet ache behind his eyes. He realized that his fear had never been of ignorance. It had been of irrelevance, of being unseen, of sitting in a room with nothing to offer. And yet, In this room, where he had offered nothing but attention, something profound had begun to unfold. The teacher finished cleaning and returned the cloth to its place. The cup remained empty now. He placed it between them. "Do not rush to fill it," he said. "Sit with it first." The seeker nodded, unable to speak. For the first time in his life, the absence of answers did not feel like failure. It felt like space. And in that space, in the quiet presence of an empty cup, the seeker sensed the edge of something vast and unfamiliar. Not knowledge, not mastery, but the possibility of true learning, waiting patiently, just beyond the need to know. The words echoed in the seeker's mind long after they had been spoken. "It's already full." They followed him into the small guest room the teacher had prepared, lingered in the pauses between breaths, surfaced again and again whenever his mind tried to return to familiar ground. He lay on the thin mattress that night, staring into darkness, feeling an unfamiliar weight, not of exhaustion, but of resistance. He had said those words himself. "Stop. It's already full." At the time, they had felt reasonable, responsible even, a logical response to excess. Yet now, replayed in silence, they sounded different. Less like wisdom, more like reflex. He began to see them not as a comment about tea, but as a confession. For years, perhaps decades, he had been saying the same thing in countless invisible ways. "I know this already. I've heard that before. This is basic. This doesn't apply to me." Always polite, always measured, rarely spoken aloud, but deeply ingrained. The realization unsettled him. He sat up, drawing his knees toward his chest, and noticed how his body held tension even at rest. His jaw was clenched, his shoulders subtly raised, as if he were constantly bracing against something. Against what? Newness, uncertainty, anything that threatened to rearrange the carefully ordered structure of his inner world. The next morning, the teacher said nothing about the previous day. They shared tea again, this time poured carefully without spilling. The seeker watched closely, half expecting another demonstration, another symbolic act. But none came. The teacher simply drank, unhurried, as though nothing significant had occurred. This, too, disturbed him. He wanted the lesson to continue, wanted clarity, wanted to know where he stood. Instead, he was offered normalcy. They sat together in quiet for a while before the seeker finally spoke. "When I asked you to stop pouring," he said slowly, "I thought I was being practical." The teacher looked at him attentively, inviting more without prompting it. "I didn't think I was resisting," the seeker continued. "I thought I was pointing out a fact." The teacher nodded gently. "Most resistance wears the mask of reason," he said. The seeker exhaled sharply. The words landed close to something tender. "I didn't feel arrogant," the seeker said. "I felt responsible, like someone who knows when enough is enough." The teacher met his gaze. "And who decides when enough has been reached?" he asked. The seeker opened his mouth, then paused. "I suppose I do." The teacher smiled faintly. "That," he said, "is where the cup quietly overflows." The seeker frowned, considering this. "I thought ego meant pride," he said, "boasting, looking down on others. I don't see myself that way." The teacher nodded. "If you do," he said, "ego is rarely loud. More often, it is cautious, protective, convincing." He leaned forward slightly. Ego does not always say, "I am better than you." Sometimes it says, "I already understand." The seeker felt a tightening in his chest. That phrase, "I already understand," had been a cornerstone of his identity. It was how he navigated the world, how he maintained coherence, how he avoided chaos. Without it, everything felt unstable. "But understanding is important," he protested gently. "It helps us avoid confusion." "Yes," the teacher agreed, "but it can also prevent discovery." They walked later that morning along a narrow path behind the dwelling. The air was cool, the ground uneven. The seeker found himself watching his footing carefully, adjusting his pace to match the teacher's unhurried steps. "Tell me," the teacher said as they walked, "what did you fear in that moment?" When the tea was spilling, the seeker asked. The teacher nodded. The seeker considered the question seriously. He searched past the obvious waste, disorder, inconvenience, and found something quieter beneath it all. "I fear being wrong," he said. The teacher stopped walking. "About what?" he asked. "About my assumptions," the seeker replied. "About how things should unfold." The teacher turned to face him. "And what happens when your assumptions are challenged?" The seeker hesitated. "I defend them," he said honestly, "or I reinterpret the situation so they still hold." The teacher smiled, not in judgment but recognition. "This is how the cup stays full," he said. "Not because nothing new arrives, but because everything new is reshaped to fit what is already there." They resumed walking. The seeker felt exposed, but also strangely relieved. Naming the pattern softened its grip. "I thought my knowledge made me open," he said. "But maybe it has made me careful." The teacher nodded. "Careful is not the same as open," he said. "Careful seeks safety. Open accepts risk." They reached a clearing where the path widened. Sunlight filtered through the trees, illuminating particles of dust in the air. The seeker stopped without realizing it, captivated by the simplicity of the scene. He felt something unfamiliar stirring, an awareness unmediated by analysis. "How often?" the teacher asked quietly. "Do you allow yourself to be changed by what you encounter?" The seeker swallowed. He had allowed himself to be informed, to be impressed, to be confirmed. But changed? Rarely. Change required surrender. And surrender felt like failure to the part of him that valued coherence and mastery. "I thought control was wisdom," he said softly. The teacher looked at him with kindness. "Control can be useful," he said, "but when it becomes identity, it turns against learning." They sat on a fallen log at the edge of the clearing. The teacher picked up a small stone and rolled it between his fingers. "When you said, 'Stop, it's already full,' he said, 'you were not protecting the cup.'" The seeker looked at him. "You were protecting yourself." The truth of the statement struck deep. He remembered how quickly the words had come, how instinctive they had felt, how little space there had been between perception and reaction. That reflex, that immediate tightening, had guided so much of his life. "What if," the seeker asked, "I don't know how to let the cup be empty?" The teacher considered this. "Then begin by noticing when you rush to fill it," he said. "Notice the discomfort, the urge to explain, the need to be certain." The seeker nodded slowly. "That urge feels like safety," he admitted. "Yes," the teacher said, "and safety has its place. But truth does not always arrive safely." They returned to the dwelling in silence. Later, as the seeker sat alone with an empty cup in front of him, he felt the familiar impulse arise again, to reflect, to summarize, to turn the experience into something he could carry away neatly. This time, he noticed it. He did not follow it. Instead, he sat with the discomfort of not knowing what to do next. The room felt different now, larger, somehow, less defined. He realized then that the greatest barrier on his path had never been ignorance. It had been the need to stop the flow, to say again and again, "It's already full," not because it was true, but because emptiness felt too risky. As the light faded and evening settled in, the seeker understood something that no book had ever taught him. Learning does not end when the cup is full. It ends when one refuses to let it overflow. And for the first time, instead of stopping the pour, he wondered, quietly, honestly, what might happen if he didn't. The seeker had expected instruction, not in the form of sermons or rules. He knew better than that, but some recognizable shape of guidance, a phrase to remember, a principle to carry, a method he could apply. Instead, what he encountered the following day was something far more disorienting. Nothing. The teacher did not revisit the lesson of the cup. He did not ask probing questions. He did not offer metaphors or commentary. He went about his morning as though the spill, the silence, and the discomfort had never occurred. They swept the courtyard together, prepared tea, sat beneath the trees as the light shifted slowly across the ground. When the seeker spoke, the teacher listened. When the seeker fell silent, the teacher remained equally present. It was unsettling. The seeker began to notice something subtle but persistent. Without resistance or affirmation, his words lost their familiar weight. They did not echo. They did not build upon themselves. They simply arose and passed. At first, he spoke more. He filled the space with observations, reflections, carefully phrased insights. He referenced the lessons he thought he was learning, articulated his struggles with emptiness, even admitted his discomfort with uncertainty. The teacher listened without interruption. No nods of encouragement, no gentle corrections, no visible signs of approval. It was as though the teacher had become a perfectly still surface, one that reflected everything placed before it, yet held onto nothing. Gradually, the seeker became aware of something deeply uncomfortable. He was performing, not consciously, not manipulatively, but habitually. Each word carried a faint expectation. Be seen, be acknowledged, be met. When none of that came, the words began to feel unnecessary. One afternoon, after a long stretch of quiet, the seeker finally asked, "Are you waiting for something?" The teacher looked at him with mild curiosity. "What do you think I'm waiting for?" he asked. The seeker hesitated. "For me to understand," he said. The teacher smiled faintly. "And what would that look like?" he asked. The seeker opened his mouth, then stopped. He realized he had no answer that did not involve demonstration, articulation, explanation, visible change. "I don't know," he said at last. The teacher nodded. "Then we are aligned." They sat together in silence after that. But the silence was no longer neutral. It had begun to work on him, quietly, persistently, like water wearing down stone, not through force, but through patience. In that silence, the seeker began to notice patterns he had never seen before. He noticed how quickly his mind labeled experience, how swiftly sensation became interpretation, interpretation became narrative, narrative became identity. He noticed how rarely he allowed anything to remain unresolved. Uncertainty made him uneasy, not because it was frightening, but because it left him without footing, without position. He had always thought of himself as adaptable, flexible, open. Now he saw something else. He was skillful at adapting things to himself. The teacher's presence offered no resistance to this pattern, and that was precisely what revealed it. There was nothing to push against, no opposition to sharpen his arguments or validate his insights. The mirror did not correct him. It showed him. One evening, as the sun dipped low and shadows lengthened across the courtyard, the seeker spoke again. Not from habit this time, but from something deeper. "I feel invisible here," he said quietly. The teacher looked at him, not with surprise, but attentiveness. "What do you mean?" he asked. "There is no response," the seeker said. "No feedback, no sign that I am progressing." The teacher considered this. "Tell me," he said, "how do you know you exist?" The question caught the seeker off guard. "I experience," he said cautiously. "I think. I feel." The teacher nodded. "Do those things require acknowledgement?" he asked. The seeker paused. "No," he admitted. "Then why does your learning require it?" the teacher asked. The seeker felt something shift uncomfortably inside him. He had always measured growth through recognition, external or internal, through milestones, insights, moments of clarity that could be named and claimed. Here, none of that was happening. And without recognition, he asked, "How do I know I am learning?" The teacher's voice softened. "Perhaps," he said, "learning is happening precisely because you do not know." The words unsettled him. He had spent his life seeking confirmation. Now he was being asked to trust transformation without evidence. That night, alone in his room, the seeker replayed the day's interactions, not for meaning, but for pattern. He saw how often he had waited for the teacher to react, how frequently he had scanned the teacher's face for cues, how subtly he had attempted to steer the encounter towards something familiar, and how gently, consistently, the teacher had refused to engage in that dance, not out of indifference, out of clarity. The teacher was not withholding guidance. He was withholding reinforcement. And without reinforcement, the seeker's ego, so accustomed to being fed through recognition, began to weaken. The next day, the teacher asked him to help prepare the garden. There was no symbolism explained, no lesson attached, just physical work, pulling weeds, turning soil, carrying water. At first, The seeker approached the task with intention. He tried to be mindful. He observed his breath. He noted sensations. Then, gradually, he forgot to do even that. His hands moved. The earth yielded. The work unfolded without commentary. At some point, he realized he had not thought about himself for several minutes. The realization startled him. He paused, breath catching slightly. The teacher noticed and smiled, not at the pause, but at what it revealed. Later, as they washed their hands, the seeker spoke. "When I stopped trying to understand," he said, "something softens." The teacher nodded. "And when you stop trying to be seen," he added, "something else becomes visible." The seeker looked at him, puzzled. "What?" he asked. The teacher gestured gently toward the garden. "What has always been here," he said. The seeker followed the gesture. The plants, the soil, the light. Nothing extraordinary, nothing symbolic, and yet everything felt strangely intimate. He realized then that the teacher's greatest lesson had never been spoken. By offering no interpretation, no validation, no intellectual foothold, the teacher had allowed the seeker to encounter himself without adornment. The mirror was not critical. It was honest. In its reflection, the seeker saw the quiet mechanisms of ego, not pride, not arrogance, but the constant need to secure identity through knowing, explaining, and being recognized. And in seeing that need clearly, without judgment, without commentary, it began to loosen. Not disappear, loosen. That night, as the seeker sat alone once more, he did not try to empty the cup. He did not try to fill it either. He simply allowed it to be. For the first time, the mirror no longer frightened him. It no longer threatened to expose him. It simply reflected what was, and that, unexpectedly, felt like enough. The teacher's lesson remained unspoken, but its effect had begun to echo far beyond words. And the seeker, though still uncertain, sensed that he was standing at the threshold of a different kind of learning, one that did not require mastery, identity, or even understanding. Only presence, only honesty, only the courage to remain, without turning away, when a mirror shows exactly what stands before it. The realization did not arrive all at once. It crept in slowly, quietly, without announcement, like a hairline crack spreading through stone. The seeker noticed it not during moments of insight, but during ordinary interactions. A hesitation before responding. A tightness in the chest when something unfamiliar arose. A subtle urge to correct rather than to receive. He had long believed violence to be obvious, loud, forceful, unmistakable. But here, in the stillness of the teacher's presence, he began to see a different form of harm. One that wore the appearance of calm, of intelligence, of good intention. It was the violence of refusal. Refusal to listen without preparing a reply. Refusal to allow confusion without rushing toward clarity. Refusal to let reality arrive unfiltered. This violence left no bruises. It raised no voices. And yet, it closed doors before they could be opened. One afternoon, as they sat facing one another in silence, the seeker became acutely aware of a familiar pattern rising within him. A thought formed, simple, almost innocent. I understand this now. The moment the thought appeared, something else followed, a subtle satisfaction, a sense of arrival. He felt steadier, grounded again in identity. Then he noticed what else happened. The silence lost its depth. The room felt smaller. Possibility narrowed. Understanding, he realized, had functioned like a wall. The moment he claimed it, experience stopped unfolding. He shifted slightly, unsettled. The teacher did not look at him, did not speak, but the seeker sensed that the moment mattered. Later that evening, as they walked together beneath the fading light, the seeker spoke. I'm beginning to see something, he said, but it doesn't feel like progress. The teacher glanced at him, curious. What does it feel like, he asked. Like something is being taken away, the seeker replied. Like I'm losing ground. The teacher nodded slowly. Ego often experiences honesty as loss, he said. The seeker frowned. But ego is about pride, isn't it? About elevating oneself. That is one of its costumes, the teacher replied. But ego's deepest function is protection. They stopped walking. Protection from what? The seeker asked. The teacher met his gaze. From uncertainty, he said. From not knowing who you are. The seeker felt a chill run through him. All his life, knowledge had served as scaffolding for identity. It told him where he stood, how he fit, what he could rely on. Without it, he felt suspended, unsupported. But how is that violent? He asked. It feels defensive, not aggressive. The teacher picked up a fallen leaf and held it between his fingers. Tell me, he said, what happens when you interrupt another's experience with your explanation? The seeker hesitated. I help him understand, he said reflexively. The teacher raised an eyebrow gently. Or, he said, you replace their direct encounter with your interpretation. The words landed sharply. The seeker thought back. How often he had responded to others' pain with insight, to confusion with clarity, to questions with frameworks. He had believed this to be kindness, guidance, wisdom. Now he saw something else. In those moments, he had not allowed space for experience to breathe. He had rushed to resolve. And when you resolve too quickly, the teacher continued, what is denied? The seeker swallowed. The experience itself, he said quietly. The teacher nodded. This is this subtle violence, he said. Not the harm of intention, but the harm of interruption. They resumed walking. The seeker felt exposed. He began to see how deeply ingrained this pattern was, not only in conversation, but in his relationship with himself. When discomfort arose, he explained it away. When doubt appeared, he analyzed it. When fear surfaced, he reframed it. Rarely did he allow anything to remain unresolved. This violence, the teacher said, does not strike outward first. It strikes inward. The seeker stopped again. Inward, he asked. Yes, the teacher replied. You deny yourself the chance to be changed. The words echoed. To be changed. He had always pursued growth, development, refinement. But change, true change, meant allowing something unfamiliar to rearrange him. That required vulnerability. An ego, he now saw, existed precisely to prevent that. The following days deepened this awareness. Whenever the seeker felt confused, he noticed an immediate tightening, a mental rush to regain footing. Whenever something challenged his understanding, he felt a faint irritation, quickly masked by politeness. He began to see ego not as an enemy, but as a guard, constantly scanning for threats to coherence. And coherence, he realized, was not truth. It was comfort. One morning, as they sat together in silence, the teacher spoke unexpectedly. Tell me, he said, what do you fear would happen if you truly did not know? The seeker closed his eyes. Images surfaced, standing before others without answers, sitting with questions that offered no resolution, encountering pain without explanation. I fear becoming meaningless, he said finally. The teacher nodded. Ego equates meaning with certainty, he said, but meaning often lives beyond it. The seeker opened his eyes. And what about learning? He asked. Doesn't it require understanding? Yes, the teacher replied, but not ownership. He leaned forward slightly. Understanding that you cling to becomes obstruction. Understanding that you release becomes doorway. The seeker felt something shift. He remembered how fiercely he guarded his conclusions, how quickly he defended them when challenged, how subtly he dismissed perspectives that unsettled him. Not because they were wrong, but because they were inconvenient. That's the violence, the teacher continued. When learning becomes conquest, when insight becomes possession. The seeker looked down at his hands. I've mistaken control for clarity, he said softly. The teacher smiled. And many mistake clarity for peace, he replied. But peace cannot be controlled. That afternoon, the teacher asked the seeker to sit alone with a single instruction. Do not improve the moment. The seeker found a quiet place beneath a tree and sat. At first, his mind rebelled. Improvement do. Observe. Adjust. Apply. Now he was asked to do none of that. A sound startled him. A bird taking flight. His mind reached to name it, categorize it, interpret its meaning. He noticed the impulse. He let it pass. A feeling arose, unease, then boredom, then restlessness. He noticed those too, without improving them, without resolving them. Minutes passed, perhaps hours. Something unexpected happened. The sensation softened. The urgency faded. He was no longer managing experience. He was inside it. When he returned to the teacher later, he said nothing. Neither did the teacher. But in that shared silence, the seeker felt something unmistakable. A gentleness. Not the gentleness of comfort, but of non-resistance. For the first time, ego's grip loosened, not because it was attacked, but because it was seen. Seen clearly. Seen without judgment. Seen as unnecessary in this moment. The subtle violence did not vanish, but it lost its authority. And in its place, something quieter emerged. A willingness to be changed. A willingness to be unfinished. A willingness to let learning arrive, not through force or certainty, but through openness and patience. The seeker realized then that the greatest harm ego caused was not arrogance, but the quiet refusal to let life touch him fully. And as that refusal softened, even slightly, he sensed the beginning of something fragile and profound. Not mastery, not enlightenment, but humility, not as weakness, but as an open door, one that did not demand answers. Only honesty, only presence, only the courage to remain still long enough for truth to arrive on its own terms. The pain did not announce itself as pain. It arrived disguised as restlessness. The seeker noticed it early in the morning, before the day had fully formed. He awoke with a strange heaviness in his chest, not quite sadness, not quite anxiety, something duller, quieter, more difficult to name. His mind reached automatically for explanation, but nothing fit. There was no clear problem to solve, no question demanding an answer. And that unsettled him. He sat on the edge of his bed, hands resting on his knees, feeling the familiar urge to do something, to meditate properly, to analyze what was arising, to apply one of the many tools he had spent years acquiring. Instead, he remembered the teacher's words from the previous day. Do not improve the moment. The instruction felt almost cruel now. To not improve meant to remain exposed. To sit with what was uncomfortable without reshaping it into something acceptable. He stayed where he was. The heaviness remained. As the day unfolded, the discomfort followed him like a shadow. During tea, during walking, during silence, it did not grow louder, but it did not fade either. It simply was unresolved, uninterpreted. He began to realize something deeply unsettling. Letting go did not feel like relief. It felt like loss. All his life, he had told others, that surrender brought peace, that release led to freedom. He had spoken eloquently about non-attachment, about the beauty of emptiness, about loosening the grip of the self. But now, as he stood on the edge of actually letting go, not conceptually but viscerally, his body resisted. What was he letting go of? Not beliefs alone, not ideas. He was letting go of orientation, the inner compass he had relied upon, the constant sense of where he stood, what he knew, how he fit, was beginning to loosen. And without it, he felt unmoored. Later that morning, he approached the teacher. There is something wrong, he said. The teacher looked at him calmly. Tell me. I feel unsettled, the seeker continued, as though something inside me is dissolving, but nothing is replacing it. The teacher nodded. Yes, he said, that is often how it begins. The seeker frowned. But it doesn't feel like awakening, he said. It feels like disorientation. The teacher smiled faintly. Awakening rarely announces itself in comforting terms, he replied. The mind prefers clarity. The heart often meets truth through confusion. They sat together for a while after that. The seeker tried to relax into the discomfort, but his body resisted. His breathing felt shallow. His thoughts circled restlessly, searching for something solid to land on. Finally, he spoke again. I feel like I'm losing myself, he said. The teacher's gaze softened. Which self, he asked. The question pierced something deep. The seeker closed his eyes. Images surfaced, not of his childhood, not of his memories, but of his role. The one who understood. the one who could explain, the one who stayed composed. That self was slipping, and beneath it, there was nothing he could name. "I don't know who I am without that," he admitted. The teacher did not answer immediately. "Pain," he said at last, "often arises when identity loosens faster than trust." The seeker opened his eyes. "Trust in what?" he asked. "Trust in not knowing," the teacher replied. The seeker exhaled sharply. Not knowing had always been something to move through, not something to rest within. A temporary state, quickly resolved by insight or understanding. Now it was being offered as ground. That afternoon, the pain intensified, not emotionally, but existentially. He found himself irritated by small things, the sound of footsteps, the slowness of the day, the lack of direction. Without realizing it, he wanted to escape the openness that had been created. He thought of leaving. The idea appeared suddenly, carrying a strange sense of relief. He imagined returning home, re-entering familiar routines, reclaiming his language and certainty. The discomfort would fade. The ground would solidify again. The thought tempted him. He brought it to the teacher that evening. "I think I'm not ready for this," he said. "Perhaps I need more preparation." The teacher listened carefully. "What feels unready?" he asked. "I feel raw," the seeker replied. "Unprotected, like I've been stripped of my armor, but given nothing in return." The teacher nodded. "Yes," he said gently, "because the armor was never meant to be replaced." The seeker looked up sharply. "Then how do I protect myself?" he asked. The teacher's answer was quiet. "By discovering that you do not need to." The seeker felt a surge of fear. The armor, his explanations, his insights, his intellectual mastery, had kept him safe for years. Without it, he felt vulnerable to confusion, to uncertainty, to being misunderstood, to pain. And yet, the pain was already here. Later that night, alone again, the seeker sat in silence. The discomfort peaked. His chest felt tight. His stomach churned. Thoughts raced, then collapsed into nothing. He felt suspended between old ground and new air, belonging fully to neither. He realized something important then. This pain was not punishment. It was withdrawal, like a body learning to function without a substance it had depended on for years. Ego, he saw now, had been a stabilizer. Not an enemy, but a compensator. It had helped him navigate the world, protect coherence, avoid fragmentation. Letting it loosen felt like losing balance. Tears came unexpectedly. Not dramatic, not cathartic, just a quiet release. He did not know what they were for, and for once, he did not try to explain them. He let them fall. The next morning, the teacher found him sitting outside, eyes red, posture slumped. "You stayed," the teacher said. The seeker nodded. "I wanted to leave," he admitted. The pain felt unnecessary. The teacher sat beside him. "Pain is not always necessary," he said, "but it is often unavoidable when you stop lying to yourself." The seeker felt something in those words, not accusation, but compassion. "I thought letting go would make me lighter," he said, "but I feel heavier." The teacher nodded. "Yes," he said, "because you're no longer floating above experience. You are inside it." They sat together in silence again. This silence was different. It was not peaceful, but it was honest. The seeker began to see that the pain he was experiencing was not the pain of loss, but the pain of contact. Contact with uncertainty, with vulnerability, with the rawness of being alive, without constant mediation. He had spent years buffering himself from this. Now, the buffers were dissolving, and though it hurt, something else was happening beneath the discomfort. A quiet strengthening, not of identity, but of presence. He was learning to stay, to remain when there was nothing to grasp, to endure the ache of not knowing without rushing to heal it. That he began to understand was the real courage of letting go, not the courage to release what hurts, but the courage to release what protects, even when what follows feels frightening and incomplete. As the day drew to a close, the seeker felt exhausted, but strangely alive. The pain had not disappeared, but it no longer felt like an enemy. It felt like a passage, and though he could not yet see where it led, he sensed deeply, intuitively, that this pain marked a threshold. Beyond it lay no answers, No certainty, but something far more honest. A way of being that did not depend on control, understanding, or identity. A way of standing open, unarmored, before life itself. And for the first time, despite the ache in his chest, the seeker did not turn away. The moment of seeing did not feel like revelation. There was no flash of clarity, no sudden expansion of insight, no sense of triumph. Instead, it came quietly, almost disappointingly, like realizing that the door you had been pushing against for years had never been locked. The seeker noticed it during something ordinary. He was walking alone along the narrow path behind the dwelling, the same path he had walked many times before. The ground was uneven, scattered with stones and roots. His steps slowed naturally, not out of intention, but because his body adjusted without instruction. And then it happened. He saw, without effort, that he had never truly been walking this path before. Not really. Before, his eyes had seen it, yes. His mind had registered trees, stones, direction. But his attention had always been elsewhere, interpreting, evaluating, reflecting, narrating. Now, for the first time, there was no narration. No commentary saying this is peaceful, or this symbolizes something, or this reminds me of teaching. There was just the path. The realization struck him with an unexpected weight. He stopped walking. A wave of humility washed over him. Not the cultivated humility he had spoken of in lectures, but something raw and wordless. A recognition that bordered on grief. I have been blind, he thought. Not blind to ideas. Not blind to concepts. But blind to what was directly in front of him. For years, he had believed his sight was sharp because his understanding was deep. He had mistaken interpretation for perception, explanation for awareness. He had not noticed the substitution. Now he did. The pain that had haunted him in recent days shifted form. It softened, losing its sharp edges, and became something quieter, an ache tinged with sorrow. Not sorrow for suffering, sorrow for absence, for how much of life he had missed while trying to understand it. He sat down on a rock beside the path and closed his eyes. Without instruction, memories surfaced, not as stories, but as sensations. Moments when someone had spoken to him vulnerably and he had responded with insight instead of presence. Times when silence had invited intimacy and he had filled it with meaning. Encounters with beauty he had quickly named and moved past. He had thought himself attentive. He had been busy. A realization unfolded slowly, layer by layer. His blindness had not been ignorance. It had been assumption. The assumption that knowing about something was the same as knowing it. The assumption that insight replaced encounter. The assumption that clarity was always preferable to uncertainty. Each assumption had acted like a lens, polishing reality into something manageable, but also flattening it. He remembered something the teacher had said days earlier. You reshape what you encounter to fit what you already hold. At the time, the words had felt abstract. Now they felt devastatingly precise. When he returned later that day, the teacher was sitting beneath a tree, watching the movement of light across the ground. The seeker sat down nearby, saying nothing at first. The teacher did not look at him. After a while, the seeker spoke softly. I see how much I've been missing. The teacher nodded slightly. What do you see? He asked. My blindness, the seeker replied. The teacher turned his head, studying him carefully, not to assess, but to listen. Tell me more, he said. I thought I was open, the seeker continued. But I was always filtering, always interpreting. I never let anything arrive without translating it into what I already understood. The teacher smiled gently. That is not unusual, he said. Most people live behind their conclusions. The seeker swallowed. I thought insight freed me, he said, but it kept me at a distance. The teacher nodded again. Insight without humility becomes a shield, he said. It protects you from being touched. The seeker felt the truth of this settle deeply in his body. Touched. That was the word. He had avoided being touched, not physically, but existentially. Touched by uncertainty, by beauty, by pain, by mystery. All of it had been softened, explained, categorized. Safer that way. But how did I not see this before? the seeker asked, frustration creeping into his voice. I studied awareness. I practiced mindfulness. I spoke about presence. The teacher looked at him kindly. Blindness, he said, is rarely the absence of vision. It is the presence of certainty. The seeker felt something in him loosen. Certainty. Yes. Certainty had given him confidence, authority, coherence. It had also closed his eyes to anything that did not confirm it. The teacher continued. When you believe you already see, he said, you stop looking. They sat quietly after that. The seeker noticed how different the silence felt now. It was no longer oppressive or empty. It was spacious, alive, full of subtle movement he had never noticed before. The sound of wind through leaves, the distant call of a bird, the rhythm of his own breath. Nothing extraordinary, and yet everything felt intimate. I'm ashamed, the seeker admitted suddenly. The teacher turned toward him. Of what, he asked. Of how much I've spoken without listening, the seeker said. How much I've taught without learning. How often I've stood between people and their own experience. The teacher considered this carefully. Shame, he said, can be another way the ego holds on to itself. The seeker frowned. Then what should I feel? He asked. The teacher shook his head gently. Feel what is present, he said. Do not add a story. The seeker nodded slowly. He closed his eyes again and allowed the sensations to arise without interpretation. The tightness in his chest, the warmth in his face, the subtle trembling in his hands. He did not label them as shame or regret. He simply let them be. Something unexpected happened. The sensations shifted on their own. The tightness softened. The trembling eased. What remained was a quiet sadness, but one that felt clean, unburdened by judgment. This sadness did not accuse him. It opened him. Later that evening, the seeker sat alone again, reflecting not in words, but in attention. He noticed how often his mind tried to return to analysis. This is an important turning point. This means something. Each time, he gently let the thought pass. For once, he did not need to capture the experience. He was inside it. He saw then that true seeing did not add anything to the world. It removed what stood in the way. And what stood in the way had always been the same thing. The belief that he was already looking clearly. The belief that understanding preceded encounter. The belief that he knew. Blindness, he realized, was not a failure. It was a condition created by certainty. And seeing one's own blindness was not humiliation. It was liberation. Because the moment he admitted he could not see fully, the world became visible again. Not as an object to be grasped, not as a lesson to be learned, but as a living presence to be met. As night settled in and the sounds of the world softened, the seeker felt something unfamiliar but deeply welcome. A sense of humility that did not diminish him. A quiet joy that did not depend on insight. He understood now why the pain of letting go had been necessary. Without it, he would never have noticed what he had been defending himself against. Life itself. And for the first time, he did not rush to name what he was experiencing. He allowed it to remain unnamed, unfinished, alive. In that unknowing, his eyes at last were open. Emptiness did not arrive as a void. It arrived as a pause. The seeker noticed it one morning as he sat alone, the world still half asleep. Light crept softly through the window, touching the floor without urgency. The air felt cool against his skin. His breath moved in and out, unremarkable, unforced. And for the first time in as long as he could remember, there was nothing he needed to add. No reflection, no conclusion, no quiet commentary waiting to claim the moment. Just this. At first, the simplicity unsettled him. His mind hovered nearby, alert, as if waiting for instruction. Is this it? It seemed to ask. Is something supposed to happen now? But nothing did. And then, almost imperceptibly, something shifted. It was not insight, not peace, not clarity. It was space. A small space, barely noticeable at first, opening between experience and response. Between sensation and interpretation. Between what was happening and what he usually did with it. A single drop of emptiness. He felt it in his chest, not as hollowness, but as relief. Like loosening a clenched fist he hadn't realized he was holding. The seeker stayed with that sensation, careful not to disturb it. Not because he feared losing it, but because he sensed that reaching for it would collapse it. This emptiness did not want to be grasped. It wanted to be left alone. As the day unfolded, he carried that quiet space with him. Not deliberately, not proudly, but gently, like something fragile that did not belong to him. He noticed how often the impulse to fill arose. A thought would appear, this is meaningful. He let it pass. A memory surfaced. This reminds me of something important. He let it pass. Even the thought, I am learning, drifted through. And he let that pass too. Each time he did not follow the impulse, the space widened just slightly. He realized then that emptiness was not something he created. It was something that appeared when he stopped interfering. Later, while walking with the teacher, he spoke quietly. Something feels different, he said, but I don't know what it is. The teacher glanced at him, eyes warm. Good, he said. The seeker smiled faintly. That's all you'll say? That is all that is needed, the teacher replied. They walked on. The seeker felt a strange tenderness in his chest. Not emotional, not sentimental, more like a softening of boundaries. He no longer felt the need to position himself in relation to the teacher. Not above, not below, not beside, just there. At one point, they stopped near a small stream. Water moved steadily over stones, shaping them over time without force, without intention. The seeker watched quietly. He noticed that he was not trying to learn from the stream. He was simply watching it. And in that watching, something subtle deepened. He began to see how much effort his mind had always applied to life, how relentlessly it tried to use experience, to turn it into meaning, into progress, into identity. Now, without that effort, experience felt lighter, more immediate, more alive. I think I understand emptiness, the seeker said suddenly, then stopped himself. The teacher raised an eyebrow gently. The seeker laughed softly. No, he corrected. I think I'm beginning to stop understanding. The teacher smiled. That is the first drop, he said. They sat by the stream for a long while. The seeker noticed that when thoughts arose, they no longer demanded allegiance. They came and went like the water before him, present, then gone. Even uncertainty felt different now. It no longer pressed against him like a threat. It rested lightly, like an open question that did not require an answer. Later that day, the seeker was asked to help prepare a simple meal. There was no instruction beyond what was practical. Wash the vegetables, cut them, place them in the pot. As he worked, he noticed something surprising. He was not narrating the task. No, this is mindfulness. No, this is a practice. No, this reflects something deeper. His hands moved. The knife rose and fell. Steam lifted gently into the air. There was a quiet joy in the ordinariness of it. Not excitement, not fulfillment, just ease. For the first time, he was not standing outside the moment, observing himself being present. He was simply present. That evening, as dusk settled in, the seeker sat alone again. He reflected, not in words, but in awareness. He saw clearly now that emptiness was not the absence of self, but the absence of grasping. The self was still there, breathing, sensing, responding, but it was no longer tightening around experience. He remembered how afraid he had been of emptiness. He had imagined it as annihilation, as meaninglessness, as loss. Now he saw how mistaken that fear had been. Emptiness was not cold. It was spacious, and within that space, life moved freely. Thoughts still appeared. Feelings still arose. But none of them demanded ownership. He did not need to say, this is mine. They came. They went. The teacher joined him quietly. You are quieter, the teacher observed. The seeker nodded. I don't feel the need to speak, he said. And that feels unfamiliar. The teacher smiled. Does it feel empty? He asked. The seeker considered the question. No, he said slowly. It feels open. The teacher's eyes softened. That openness, he said, is not something you must protect. It protects itself when you stop filling it. The seeker sat with those words. He realized then that emptiness was not something achieved once and for all. It appeared moment by moment, whenever he chose not to grasp, whenever he allowed experience to be incomplete, whenever he resisted the urge to conclude. This was not an ending. It was a beginning so subtle it almost went unnoticed. The first drop of emptiness did not transform his life. It changed how he met it, and that was enough. As night fell, the seeker felt a quiet gratitude, not for understanding, not for progress, but for the simple fact that he no longer needed to hold everything together. The cup, once rigidly full, had begun to loosen, not emptied completely, just enough. Enough for something new to arrive, not as knowledge, not as insight, but as life itself, moving freely through an open hand. And for the first time, the seeker trusted that he did not need to know what would come next. He only needed to leave space for it. In that space, the journey continued, silently, gently, one ungrasped moment at a time. The change was subtle at first, so subtle that the seeker almost missed it. He noticed it one morning while listening to the sound of rain. Before, such a moment would have triggered a familiar cascade of associations. Teachings about impermanence, metaphors about cleansing, reflections on stillness. Rain had always meant something. Now it simply fell. There was no impulse to name it, no urge to extract wisdom from it, no quiet satisfaction in recognizing it as a symbol. The sound arrived at his ears, passed through him, and disappeared without leaving a trace. And in that absence of commentary, something tender stirred. Wonder. It startled him. Wonder had not been part of his inner vocabulary for a long time. Curiosity, yes. Interest, certainly. But wonder, the kind that does not seek explanation, the kind that opens rather than concludes, had quietly faded from his life. He realized then that he had been approaching the world like a collector. Each experience had been something to acquire, categorize, integrate into a growing structure of understanding. Even humility had become a possession. Even emptiness had threatened to turn into an achievement. Now, something different was happening. He was not collecting. He was encountering. Later that day, as he walked with the teacher, he spoke about it. "I feel inexperienced," he said, searching for the right word, "as if I don't know how to stand in front of things anymore." The teacher smiled. "That is a good place to stand," he said. "It is where learning begins." The seeker frowned slightly. "It feels inefficient," he admitted. "I don't know what to do with what I perceive." The teacher stopped walking and turned to face him. "Why must you do anything with it?" he asked. The seeker hesitated. The question exposed an assumption so ingrained he had never questioned it. That experience existed to be used. "I suppose I thought learning meant transforming experience into understanding," he said. The teacher nodded. "That is one kind of learning," he said. "But there is another." They resumed walking. The path curved gently through the trees. Sunlight filtered through leaves, shifting constantly, never settling long enough to be held. "The mind you are discovering," the teacher continued, "is sometimes called the beginner's mind." The seeker had heard the phrase many times before. He had quoted it in lectures, written about it in notes, admired it from a distance. Now, it felt uncomfortably close. "Beginner's mind sounds naive," the seeker said. "Unformed." The teacher chuckled softly. "Naivety is not the same as openness," he said. "One is ignorance. The other is availability." The seeker considered this as they walked. Availability. That word resonated deeply. He noticed how available he felt now. Not in the sense of being prepared, but in the sense of not being occupied by himself. His attention no longer revolved around monitoring his understanding, measuring progress, or maintaining coherence. He was simply present, and presence, he realized, required no expertise. That afternoon, the teacher asked the seeker to sit by the river alone. "Do not meditate," the teacher said. "Do not observe yourself observing. Just sit." The instruction felt disarming. The seeker complied. At first, his mind searched for footing. Old habits stirred, counting breaths, noticing sensations, labeling thoughts. Each time he recognized the impulse and let it dissolve. Gradually, effort fell away. He found himself watching the river without intention. Water moved endlessly over rocks. changing shape with each obstacle, never repeating itself. The seeker felt a quiet delight rise, not because the scene was meaningful, but because it was alive. He realized then that a child does not stand before a river seeking insight. A child stands before it and is captured. Time disappeared. When the seeker finally returned, the teacher looked at him and said nothing. And for once, the seeker did not fill the silence. The next days unfolded differently. The seeker noticed that questions arose without urgency. When something puzzled him, he no longer rushed to resolve it. He allowed curiosity to remain open-ended. This was new. Previously, curiosity had always been directional, aimed toward understanding. Now, it felt circular, self-sustaining, content to exist without conclusion. He watched insects move across the ground and felt no need to identify them. He listened to conversations without preparing responses. He tasted food without evaluating it. Each moment felt fresh, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was unfiltered. He began to see how much effort had once gone into being someone who knew. Knowing had required constant reinforcement. Beginner's mind required nothing. One evening, as the sky darkened and stars began to emerge, the seeker spoke again. "I feel small," he said. The teacher looked at him kindly. "And how does that feel?" he asked. "Strangely comforting," the seeker replied. "As if I no longer need to be large." The teacher nodded. "The ego grows by expansion," he said. "The beginner's mind grows by intimacy." The seeker felt the truth of this immediately. Intimacy, with sound, with movement, with uncertainty, with not knowing what something meant. He remembered how often he had stood at a distance from life, interpreting rather than participating. Now, without explanation as a buffer, he felt closer to everything and more vulnerable. But the vulnerability no longer frightened him. It felt honest. The teacher continued. "A child does not approach the world with answers," he said. "A child approaches it with eyes." The seeker smiled. "And adults?" he asked. "Adults," the teacher replied, "approach the world with conclusions." They sat together quietly. The seeker reflected, not intellectually, but gently, on how far he had traveled without going anywhere. How the journey inward had not added depth, but removed layers. He was not becoming wiser in the way he had imagined. He was becoming simpler. And simplicity, he saw now, was not reduction. It was clarity without possession. The next morning, the seeker woke early. He stepped outside and felt the cool air on his skin. The world seemed new, not because it had changed, but because he was no longer standing between himself and it. He did not think, "This is awakening." He did not think anything at all. And that was the miracle. The mind of a child was not ignorant of complexity. It was unburdened by it. It did not reject understanding, but it did not cling to it either. As the sun rose, the seeker understood something without turning it into a thought. True learning does not move from not knowing to knowing. It moves from knowing back to not knowing, but this time without fear. And in that fearless unknowing, the world opened endlessly, moment after moment, just as it always had, waiting patiently for someone willing to meet it without pretense, without armor, without the need to be right. The cup was not empty. It was ready, and that readiness, soft, curious, undefended, was the true beginning. The seeker began to notice something quietly unsettling. The insights no longer stayed. In the past, when understanding arrived, it would anchor itself firmly in his mind. He would revisit it, refine it, repeat it to himself until it became part of his internal architecture. Wisdom, he believed, was something accumulated, layer by layer, until it formed a stable foundation upon which he could stand. Now, insight appeared and vanished. A realization would arise softly, illuminate a moment, and then dissolve without leaving a trace. At first, this frightened him. He worried that he was forgetting, that something essential was slipping through his fingers. But the teacher did not seem concerned. One afternoon, as they sat beneath the shade of a tree, the seeker voiced his unease. "I feel like I'm not retaining anything," he said. "Understanding comes, but it doesn't stay." The teacher smiled gently. Why should it? He asked. The question caught the seeker off guard. Isn't wisdom meant to remain? The seeker asked. To be integrated? The teacher picked up a small twig from the ground and rolled it between his fingers. Tell me, he said, does the wind keep its shape after it passes through the trees? The seeker shook his head. No, he said. Yet, the teacher continued, the trees are moved by it. The seeker felt something shift inside him. He had always imagined wisdom as something he could own, something stable and reliable, something he could return to in moments of doubt. Now, that idea felt increasingly strained. You want wisdom to belong to you, the teacher said calmly. But wisdom does not belong. The seeker frowned slightly. Then what is it? He asked. The teacher looked out toward the horizon. It is response, he said, not possession. They sat in silence for a while after that. The seeker watched thoughts arise and pass like clouds. Each one felt lighter than before, less demanding. Even the thought, I am learning, no longer insisted on permanence. He began to see how tightly he had once clung to understanding. Not because it was true, but because it made him feel secure. Security, he realized, had been the hidden currency of his search. He had pursued knowledge not to meet life more fully, but to shield himself from its unpredictability. Wisdom, as he had practiced it, had become a form of insurance. Later that day, the teacher asked him to fetch water from the well. The task was simple. The seeker took a bucket, walked to the well, lowered it, and drew water. As he carried it back, he noticed the water sloshing with each step, responding instantly to movement. He paused. In the past, he would have tried to steady the bucket, to prevent spilling, to maintain control. Now, he watched the water move freely, adjusting naturally to the rhythm of his walking. When he returned, the teacher observed him quietly. What did you notice? The teacher asked. The water doesn't resist, the seeker replied. It moves with whatever is happening. The teacher nodded. Wisdom is like that, he said. It responds to life as it is, not as you wish it to be. The seeker felt a quiet recognition. He remembered how often he had applied the same understanding to vastly different situations, forcing reality to conform to what he already knew. He had prized consistency over sensitivity, coherence over presence. That, too, had been possession. What happens, the seeker asked, when wisdom is not stored? The teacher smiled. Then you must meet each moment freshly, he said. The thought both excited and frightened him. Meeting each moment freshly meant there was no fallback, no stored answer, no pre-established conclusion. It meant risk. That evening, the seeker sat alone and reflected, not by thinking but by noticing. He noticed how instinctively his mind tried to hold onto pleasant realizations. When a sense of clarity appeared, his mind reached for it, wanting to preserve it. Each time he noticed this grasping, the clarity faded. At first, he felt frustration. Then understanding dawned, not as insight, but as experience. Wisdom could not be held because holding changed its nature. To grasp wisdom was to turn it into knowledge. And knowledge, once possessed, quickly became outdated. He began to see the difference. Knowledge accumulated. Wisdom responded. Knowledge belonged to the past. Wisdom lived only in the present. The next morning, the teacher spoke again. You have spent years carrying wisdom as identity, he said. That is a heavy burden. The seeker nodded. I wanted to be someone who knew, he said quietly. And now, the teacher asked. The seeker considered the question deeply. I want to be someone who listens, he said. The teacher smiled. That is lighter, he said. As days passed, the seeker noticed a profound shift in how he related to others. When people spoke, he no longer listened for points to agree with or challenge. He listened for tone, for hesitation, for what was not being said. He did not feel compelled to respond with insight. Often, silence felt more appropriate. And in that silence, something remarkable happened. Others relaxed. They spoke more freely. They found their own words. The seeker realized then that possession of wisdom had often placed him above others, even when he believed he was helping. Now, Without needing to demonstrate understanding, he stood beside them. This too was wisdom. One evening, as the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the ground, the seeker asked the teacher one final question. If wisdom cannot be possessed, he said, how do I trust it will be there when I need it? The teacher looked at him with quiet certainty. Just as your breath arrives when you inhale, he said, not because you own it, but because you allow it. The seeker felt something in his chest soften. He saw now that wisdom was not something to be stored, protected, or defended. It was something that arrived when space was available, when ego loosened, when certainty fell away, when the cup was not being guarded. That night, the seeker slept deeply. No thoughts of progress visited him, no urge to remember or preserve the day's experiences. And in that rest, he understood something without words. Wisdom without possession does not disappear. It flows. It adapts. It meets life exactly where it is. And because it is not owned, it cannot be lost. The seeker no longer feared forgetting. There was nothing to forget. There was only the next moment, alive, unrepeatable, and complete. And he was finally learning how to meet it. At some point, the seeker realized something quietly unsettling. The teacher had not taught him anything, not in the way he had expected. There were no doctrines given, no practices assigned, no philosophies transmitted, no framework he could carry away, no insight he could quote, no method he could reproduce elsewhere. And yet, everything had changed. The realization arrived not as disappointment, but as awe. He noticed it one morning while sitting alone, watching the light move slowly across the floor. There was nothing to do, nothing to understand, nothing to improve. And still, he felt deeply attentive, awake in a way that required no effort. It struck him then. Nothing had been added. Everything unnecessary had been removed. He remembered how he had arrived, carrying questions sharpened by years of study. He had expected answers, perhaps subtle ones, paradoxical ones, but answers nonetheless. He had imagined learning as acquisition, even in its most refined spiritual forms. Instead, the teacher had offered absence, silence instead of explanation, presence instead of instruction, space instead of certainty. At first, the seeker had resisted this. He had searched for hidden lessons, symbolic gestures, implied teachings. He had tried to decode the teacher's actions, believing meaning must be concealed somewhere. Now he saw the mistake. There had been nothing hidden, nothing withheld, nothing given. The teacher had not been trying to teach him something. He had been creating conditions in which learning could happen on its own. Later that day, as they shared tea, the seeker spoke. I don't know what I will say to people when they ask what you taught me, he said. The teacher smiled. Why must you say anything? He asked. The seeker considered this. In the past, he said slowly, I would have wanted to bring something back. A lesson, a message. The teacher nodded. And now, he asked. Now, the seeker said, I feel like bringing something back would miss the point. The teacher's eyes softened. Yes, he said, because what you found cannot be carried. They sat quietly, the tea cooling between them. The seeker reflected on this deeply. All his life, he had associated teaching with transmission. Knowledge passed from one mind to another. Wisdom conveyed through words, texts, explanations. Even silence, he had believed, was a technique, a tool used deliberately to provoke insight. Now he saw something subtler. The teacher had not used silence. He had inhabited it. There was no agenda behind it, no strategy, no manipulation designed to produce awakening. The teacher had not been trying to shape the seeker's experience. He had simply refused to interfere, and that refusal had been transformative. One afternoon, the seeker finally asked the question that had been forming quietly for days. If you were not teaching me, he said, what were you doing? The teacher looked at him thoughtfully. I was not standing between you and reality, he said. The simplicity of the answer left the seeker speechless. He realized then how many teachers he had encountered, how many books he had read, how many systems he had studied, all of which stood in subtle ways between him and his own experience. They had offered interpretation before encounter, meaning before presence, structure before openness. The teacher here had done the opposite. He had stepped aside. That was the teaching. The seeker began to see how radical this was. To teach nothing required immense trust, not in the student, but in life itself. Trust that awareness would arise if left unobstructed. Trust that truth did not require enforcement. Trust that wisdom did not need to be delivered. The teacher trusted what the seeker had long distrusted, that nothing essential was missing. As days passed, the seeker noticed how the teacher responded to questions, not by answering them, but by allowing them to dissolve. When the seeker asked about emptiness, the teacher pointed to the open sky. When he asked about wisdom, the teacher listened. When he asked about fear, the teacher stayed present. There was no redirection, no conclusion, no attempt to replace one belief with another. At first, this had felt evasive. Now it felt precise. The teacher was not avoiding answers. He was refusing to replace the seeker's dependence on answers with dependence on himself. One evening, the seeker watched the teacher sweep the courtyard. The movements were unremarkable, unhurried, unadorned. No symbolism, no demonstration, just sweeping. The seeker felt something open inside him. He understood, then, that the teacher was not modeling enlightenment. He was modeling ordinariness without interference. And that, he saw, was far more challenging. Extraordinary experiences were easy to admire from a distance. Ordinary presence required participation. That night, the seeker sat alone and reflected, not to analyze, but to notice. He noticed that he no longer felt the need to ask questions. Not because he had answers, but because the questions no longer carried urgency. They rose. They fell. They did not demand resolution. This, too, was a teaching. The teacher had not taught him how to answer questions. He had taught him how to remain with them. The next morning, as the seeker prepared to leave, he felt an unexpected sadness, not of loss, but of gratitude. He approached the teacher one final time. "I feel like I haven't learned anything," he said softly. The teacher smiled gently. "Good," he said. The seeker laughed quietly, understanding. "And yet," he continued, "I feel different." The teacher nodded. "Learning that changes you," he said, "does not announce itself as learning." They stood together for a moment. The seeker wanted to bow, to express reverence, to mark the moment with significance. But the impulse passed. Instead, he simply stood, present. Before leaving, he asked one last question. "How do I continue without you?" he asked. The teacher met his gaze calmly. "You already are," he said. The words landed softly and completely. As the seeker walked away, he realized something profound. The teacher had not been a guide leading him forward. He had been a mirror revealing what was already here. By teaching nothing, he had allowed everything to be seen. And now, as the seeker stepped back into the world, he understood that the real teaching had never belonged to the teacher. It had belonged to the space the teacher refused to fill. A space where the seeker could finally meet life directly, without instruction, without possession, without the need to become anything other than what he already was. The cup did not need to be filled. The path did not need to be explained. And the teacher, by teaching nothing, had offered the most difficult, most generous gift of all, the freedom to see for himself, and to continue seeing, endlessly, quietly, without anyone standing in the way. When the seeker finally left the dwelling, he carried nothing with him. No notes, no instructions, no words carefully stored for later use. This absence startled him at first. As he walked back along the winding path that led away from the teacher's home, he felt a faint anxiety rising, an old reflex, familiar and insistent. Have I missed something? Should I have asked one last question? What if I forget what I learned? The questions came quickly, almost urgently. They were the mind's way of reaching for ground. He paused and noticed them, and then, without effort, he let them pass. Something had changed. In the past, questions like these would have demanded answers. They would have pulled him back into analysis, into reconstruction, into the familiar labor of turning experience into something portable. Now, they felt optional. He continued walking. As the road widened and the sounds of the world slowly returned, distant voices, footsteps, the hum of activity, he felt a quiet curiosity rather than apprehension. How would he live now? Not as a project, not as an experiment, but as a person moving through ordinary days. The first test came sooner than expected. When he reached the small town at the edge of the forest, he stopped at a modest cafe to rest. The place was unremarkable: wooden tables, soft murmurs of conversation, the clink of cups and plates. He ordered tea. As the cup was placed before him, he noticed a familiar sensation stirring, a subtle readiness to do something with the moment, to observe, to interpret, to recognize significance. Then he saw it. The cup was not full, and it was not empty. It was simply there, warm, waiting. He smiled quietly. This time, the smile did not come from understanding. It came from recognition. He realized then that the lesson of the cup had not ended when the teacher stopped pouring. It had not ended when the cup was emptied. It had not even ended when he learned to let it remain empty. The true lesson was something else entirely. The cup was never meant to stay empty, nor was it meant to stay full. It was meant to be usable. He lifted the cup and took a sip. The taste was ordinary, and somehow that was enough. As the days passed, he returned to the rhythms of daily life, traveling, speaking with people, moving through familiar spaces that now felt subtly different. Nothing outward had changed, but inwardly, the way he met experience had shifted. He noticed how often he had once approached life with an agenda, even spiritual ones. How frequently he had tried to shape moments into lessons, conversations into exchanges of meaning, silence into insight. Now, he allowed moments to arrive without instruction. He spoke when words felt natural. He listened when silence felt right. He did not force either. At times, old habits resurfaced. In conversations, he would catch himself preparing a response before the other person had finished speaking. In moments of discomfort, he would feel the familiar urge to explain, to resolve, to regain footing. Each time, he noticed, and that noticing was enough. He did not scold himself. He did not congratulate himself. He simply returned to openness. The cup emptied itself again and again, and each time it filled naturally without resistance. One afternoon, he met an old colleague, a fellow scholar who had admired his work for years. They spoke of ideas, of theories, of spiritual paths. At one point, the colleague asked, "So what have you discovered recently?" The seeker paused. In the past, he would have answered quickly, summarizing insights, articulating shifts, offering something impressive. Now, nothing like that came. "I don't know how to answer that," he said honestly. The colleague laughed. "After all these years, you don't know?" The seeker smiled gently. "Not in the way I used to," he replied. And to his surprise, the conversation deepened. Without needing to prove understanding, he listened more fully. Without claiming authority, he spoke more simply. There was no hierarchy, just two people sharing a moment. Later, as he walked alone, he reflected quietly. He saw now that the need to be right had been one of the heaviest burdens he had carried. It had shaped his relationships, his teaching, even his silence. Without it, life felt lighter. Not easier, but more fluid. The cup, he realized, could only remain usable if it was allowed to empty continuously. Not once, always. This did not mean rejecting knowledge or insight. It meant refusing to cling to them. Each moment asked something different. A different response, a different sensitivity, a different humility. Some days required clarity. Others required silence. Some required action. Others required waiting. There was no formula. And that was the point. One evening, as he sat alone watching the sun set, a memory surfaced, something the teacher had said long ago. When the cup is full, nothing new can enter. At the time, he had understood this as instruction. Now, he understood it as description. Life was always pouring. Experience never stopped arriving. The only question was whether he would allow space for it, or insist on holding what had already passed. He watched the colors of the sky shift gradually, imperceptibly. He did not try to name them. He did not try to capture the moment. He let it pass. And in doing so, he felt something settle deeply within him. A trust. Not trust in understanding. Not trust in memory. Not trust in progress. Trust in responsiveness. He trusted now that when life asked something of him, he would meet it, not because he had prepared the right answer, but because he was not occupied by old ones. This was not emptiness as absence. It was emptiness as readiness. A cup that is always empty is not deprived. It is available. Available to joy. Available to grief. Available to confusion. Available to clarity. Available to life as it is. As darkness fell and stars emerged, the seeker felt no urge to mark the moment as significant. It did not need to be. Significance had lost its grip on him. Presence was enough. He understood now that learning did not move toward completion. There was no final state to reach, no perfected self to become. Learning was ongoing participation, a willingness to be surprised, a refusal to settle. The cup would fill, the cup would empty, again and again, and each time he would meet it without resistance. Not as a seeker chasing truth, not as a teacher dispensing wisdom, but as a human being, awake, responsive, unfinished. The journey had not ended. It had simply lost its urgency. And in that loss, something infinitely more precious had emerged. The freedom to live without needing to arrive. The freedom to remain open. The freedom of a cup that is always empty, and therefore always alive. The first moment it happened, the seeker almost missed it. It was an ordinary conversation, unremarkable in every visible way. Two people speaking, exchanging thoughts, filling the space between them with words that felt familiar, even routine. In the past, this kind of moment would have activated something automatic inside him, a quiet positioning, an unconscious measuring of whose understanding stood on firmer ground. But this time, something did not engage. The impulse to correct never arrived. The realization came afterward, gently, like noticing the absence of a sound you had grown used to hearing. He felt no triumph, no sense of moral superiority, no pride and restraint, only ease. For much of his life, being right had felt like stability. It offered certainty in uncertain terrain, identity in ambiguous situations. It told him who he was in relation to others. It gave him footing. Now, without that footing, he found himself standing in a different way. Not less steady, more flexible. He noticed how deeply the need to be right had shaped his interactions. Even when he spoke softly, even when he disagreed politely, there had always been an undercurrent, a subtle tension, a readiness to defend, to explain, to justify. Being right was not always about dominance. Often, it was about safety. It kept him from feeling lost. It protected him from the discomfort of ambiguity. It reassured him that he understood enough to remain intact. Letting go of that need felt, at first, like stepping onto unstable ground. But as days passed, he began to sense something unexpected. The ground was not unstable. It was simply unmapped. In conversations, he noticed himself listening differently, not for gaps to fill or errors to correct, but for meaning unfolding in real time. He no longer anticipated the end of the sentence while the other person was still speaking. He was not waiting. He was there. One afternoon, a friend spoke passionately about a belief the seeker did not share. In the past, this would have triggered an internal debate, arguments forming silently, evidence assembling itself neatly behind his eyes. Now, the arguments arose and faded. He felt curiosity instead. Not curiosity aimed at dismantling the belief, but curiosity about the person holding it, about what need it served, about what experience had shaped it. He asked questions, not strategic ones, genuine ones. The conversation softened. The friend relaxed. There was no clash of ideas, just an exchange of presence. The seeker realized then how often being right had stood in the way of being close. Certainty had created distance, not always visible, but always felt. Without the need to assert correctness, relationships began to breathe. Disagreements no longer felt threatening. They became differences, not battlegrounds. This shift extended inward as well. He noticed how frequently he had tried to be right about himself, right about his intentions, right about his progress, right about his understanding. When discomfort arose, he used to interpret it as failure or regression. When clarity appeared, he labeled it advancement. Now he allowed states to pass without judgment. Confusion no longer meant error. Clarity no longer meant arrival. Both were simply movements. He stopped arguing with himself, and in that silence, he felt a new kind of honesty emerge. One evening, while walking alone, he remembered how often he had defended his interpretations of life, his narratives of who he was, where he was going, what things meant. Those narratives had once felt essential. Now, they felt optional. He could let them go. The absence of a fixed story did not leave him empty. It left him open. At times, old habits resurfaced. In moments of stress, he felt the familiar tightening, a reflexive need to assert control through understanding. To label, explain, categorize. Each time, he noticed it gently and let it pass. He did not try to eradicate the impulse. He no longer saw it as an enemy. It was simply an old pattern, loosening slowly. Living without the need to be right did not mean abandoning discernment. He still recognized what felt true. He still made choices. He still held values. But those values were no longer weapons. They were guides. He no longer needed others to agree in order to feel grounded. Groundedness now came from responsiveness, not certainty. One morning, he found himself in a disagreement that mattered. The topic was important. The consequences real. In the past, this would have activated his full intellectual arsenal. This time, he spoke carefully, honestly, without force. When challenged, he listened. When misunderstood, he clarified, but without urgency. He noticed that clarity did not require insistence. The conversation ended without resolution, and he felt at peace. This surprised him. He realized then that resolution had often been a substitute for trust. Trust that life could continue without closure. Trust that meaning did not depend on agreement. Living without the need to be right did not simplify life. It deepened it. He began to see how much energy had once been spent defending positions, protecting identity, maintaining coherence. Without that burden, attention became available for something else. For care, for nuance, for the complexity of human experience. He felt less inclined to judge, not because he believed judgment was wrong, but because he saw how limited it was. Judgment froze moments into conclusions. Presence allowed them to remain alive. One evening, as he sat watching the world grow quiet, he felt a subtle gratitude, not for having arrived at some enlightened state, but for having stopped insisting on one. He understood now that the need to be right was deeply tied to fear, the fear of not knowing, of being mistaken, of being exposed. By releasing that need, he had not eliminated fear. He had stopped organizing his life around it. There was freedom in that. Freedom to change his mind. Freedom to admit uncertainty. Freedom to say, I don't know, without shrinking. Freedom to let others be right without feeling diminished. This freedom did not make him passive. It made him responsive. He could act without aggression, speak without defense, listen without agenda. The cup, once guarded so carefully, now remained open by default. Not because he had disciplined himself to keep it empty, but because he no longer feared what might enter. As the night deepened, he reflected quietly. Living without the need to be right did not mean surrendering truth. It meant surrendering the ego's claim on it. Truth, he saw now, did not need ownership. It revealed itself in responsiveness, in humility, in the willingness to remain unfinished. The greatest relief of all was this. He no longer had to hold the world together with his understanding. He could let it be. And in letting it be, he finally discovered what he had been seeking all along. Not certainty, not mastery, not correctness, but a way of living that was spacious enough to include not knowing. A way of being that did not collapse when answers failed. A way of standing in the world without armor, without argument, without the need to win. Just present. just awake, just human. And that, he realized, was more than enough. The freedom did not arrive with certainty. It arrived when certainty no longer felt necessary. The seeker noticed this on a day so ordinary it almost went unnoticed. There was no teaching moment, no internal breakthrough, no quiet voice announcing completion. The day unfolded like any other. Light entering the room, sounds drifting in from outside, the rhythm of breath continuing without instruction. And yet, something fundamental had shifted. He woke without a question waiting for him. In the past, his mornings had often begun with orientation. Who am I today? What am I learning? Where am I in my journey? Even when the questions were subtle, they structured his sense of self. Now, there was no structure to rebuild. He simply rose. At first, this absence felt strange, like stepping into a room where the furniture had been rearranged, not removed, but no longer fixed. He could move freely, but there were no familiar edges to lean against. Instead of discomfort, he felt ease. Not the ease of comfort, but the ease of unburdening. He no longer needed to know what the day would bring in order to meet it. As he moved through the hours, he noticed how lightly experience touched him. Joy came and went without being captured. Discomfort arose without needing explanation. Moments did not demand interpretation to feel complete. He had not lost meaning. He had lost the habit of manufacturing it. This distinction mattered deeply. For years, meaning had been something he actively constructed, through understanding, through coherence, through narrative. It had required effort. It had required vigilance. Now, meaning emerged naturally when it was needed and dissolved when it was not. He realized then that the constant need to know had never been about truth. It had been about reassurance. Knowing had offered him a sense of control in a world that could not be controlled. It had promised safety, coherence, identity. Letting go of knowing had not made the world less uncertain. It had made uncertainty less threatening. This was the quiet freedom, not the freedom to do whatever he wanted. The freedom to stop defending himself against life. He noticed this most clearly in moments that once unsettled him. When plans changed unexpectedly, he no longer tightened. When conversations drifted into ambiguity, he did not rush to clarify. When emotions arose without explanation, he did not interrogate them. He stayed. He listened. He responded when response was needed and rested when it was not. There was no formula guiding him. And that was the relief. He saw now how deeply he had relied on frameworks, not only intellectual ones, but emotional and spiritual ones as well. He had carried maps for how awakening should unfold, how insight should feel, how peace should appear. Those maps had once been helpful. Then they had become cages. Now, without them, the landscape felt vast and alive. He could get lost and not panic. He could wander and not fear inefficiency. He could pause and not label it stagnation. Not knowing had ceased to be a gap to be filled. It had become a space to live within. One afternoon, as he sat quietly watching the movement of people passing by, he felt a gentle smile rise. Not because he understood something new, but because he did not need to. Understanding had once been his primary way of relating to the world. Now, relationship itself was enough. He noticed how differently he experienced others. He did not try to place them within categories. He did not measure their insight against his own. He did not feel the need to align or disagree immediately. He allowed people to be incomplete, just as he allowed himself to be. This changed everything. Without the need to know who someone was, he could meet who they were becoming. Without the need to define himself, he could adapt naturally. He began to see how much effort identity had once required, how many subtle adjustments, explanations, and defenses it demanded. Without that effort, energy returned, not in dramatic bursts, in quiet availability. He was available to listen longer, to wait, to act without overthinking, to rest without guilt. The freedom of not knowing was not passivity. It was responsiveness without preconception. At times, he still felt the old reflex stir, the desire to conclude, to name, to resolve. When it arose, he smiled inwardly. He did not suppress it. He no longer abated. It passed on its own. This, too, was freedom. He had not replaced one identity with another. He had stopped insisting on having one at all. As the days continued, the seeker understood something essential. There was no final lesson waiting at the end of this path. No state of permanent clarity. No arrival that would secure him forever. And this understanding did not disappoint him. It relieved him. The journey no longer pointed toward completion. It pointed toward participation. Each moment asked something different. Sometimes attention, sometimes action, sometimes silence, sometimes rest. There was no need to anticipate which. He trusted himself now, not because he had answers, but because he was present. That presence was enough. The cup remained what it had always been. Not full, not empty, available. He could fill it with knowledge when knowledge was needed. He could empty it when knowledge became heavy. He no longer mistook either state for truth. Truth, he saw now, was not contained. It was encountered. The quiet freedom of not knowing did not make him special. It made him ordinary in the most profound way. He was no longer standing apart from life, interpreting it from a distance. He was inside it, breathing with it, responding to it. And in that intimacy, something settled deeply within him. A peace that did not depend on understanding. A confidence that did not require certainty. A freedom that did not need to be declared. As night fell and the world softened into stillness, the seeker felt no urge to summarize his journey. There was nothing to conclude, nothing to carry forward except openness itself. He allowed the day to end without explanation. And in doing so, he understood, without words, that this was the true gift of the path. Not answers that could be remembered, but a way of living that did not require them. The cup would fill again. The cup would empty again. Questions would arise. Uncertainty would return. And each time, he would meet it without resistance. Not because he had mastered letting go, but because he no longer needed to hold on. In that gentle, unclaimed space, life continued to unfold, quietly, honestly, and completely. And for the first time, that was enough.